to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. When it comes to the pillars of philosophy, aesthetics tends to be the one that gets overlooked. However, important and fascinating topics can be found under this branch, as well as some of the most embedded and unexamined biases. Today, we'll be talking about symmetry, a concept that is elegantly simple but requires deeper thinking. So I'm going to go ahead and say it now. I think that at some point in the future, we're going to do a symmetry too. Before we even start
well,
this.
that just makes sense because then we'll have a balance.
Yeah, because, man, you and I have a running list of topics that we can fall back on. Normally, one of us is chomping at the bit to do something each week.
Yes.
But every once in a while, we go, well, I don't have anything specific. Do you? Nah, let's look at the list. So this week, we looked at the list, and I was like, symmetry, that's kind of an interesting one. I just picked it. Then I started doing the research, and man, symmetry might be one of the deepest topics. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a qualitative sense necessarily, because obviously there's topics like God or time or reality that are very deep. But quantitatively, the way that the word symmetry is applied across sciences, all the, music, art, social sciences,
it's ubiquitous. It is ubiquitous.
It's just a gigantic topic. So I think that we're going to look at some very broad questions today that will probably take us a long time to talk about back and forth. And then in the future, I'm guessing we'll either do a second episode or we might even talk about symmetry in a specific topic, or several specific topics at some point in the future.
I'm glad we're approaching it this way because I'd rather put on the ice skates and zip over and trip and crash and not break the ice entirely. And then, choose something because it is, when you suggested it, okay. Yeah. And I went to aesthetics first, but then but I need to recheck the etymology of this and so on, as we always do. And then the physics appears and, oh my gosh, the word has changed so much.
Yeah.
The concept has changed so much.
Yeah. And even like the intro that I wrote the intro, before I started doing some of the research, because this was just a crazy week for me between school and work. And then I had a podcast yesterday with Dr. Fujian Zhang that I was preparing for. And so I was pressed for time. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to write the intro and then I'll get over to doing the research and writing the questions later. So the intro is very heavily based on aesthetics, but I don't even know if that's necessarily going to be the biggest part of the conversation. There's so much to symmetry that we'll see where it takes us. But you mentioned the etymology. What is symmetry? How has that sort of progressed?
Well, it's originally in the most ancient languages, it is, if you take the two parts, it means together measure. Syn, S-Y-N, and metron. And that becomes, by the 1500s, a harmonic arrangement. So together measure to a harmonic arrangement, just that much is interesting. And that's only from one etymological source. If you go to some of the others and start looking at what Aristotle and the pre-Socratics were talking about, it's a correspondence of parts. Now, that's not so far from where the physics goes. I'm sort of drawing all the pins with strings out here. But the idea of harmony, the idea of things that no matter how you look at them, you're going to be able to see the same thing, even if it's opposite. And but it began mostly as an aesthetic notion, and then started to be picked up in we said many, many, many times. All the sciences emerge out of the cauldron of philosophy. Everything does. And So it didn't take long for symmetry about how the world looks, about how things that you break open and look at. Uh, I've forgotten the name of the stone now.
Oh, like a geode or
A geode,
yeah.
yeah. And so it starts with that harmonic idea.
Yeah, it's that etymological evolution is really interesting because together measure, you can sort of imagine that that might have originated in carpentry, right? Like if you're trying to build a table and you wanted to make sure the legs were equal length,
Yep.
you might measure the two pieces of wood together and then might even cut them together in order to ensure that you had equal length so that the table would be even or something like that. That, this is pure speculation, but you could see how that sort of term together measure would mean, you'd have this very physical sort of representation to it.
And also with. The other interpretation was with measure, which is equally, and does certainly bring up carpentry. And I like that you've gone there. I think that because there's a utility, but usually symmetry is not talked about primarily in terms of utility.
Right. And especially, like you said, with that second leap to, what was it, a harmonious
whole, a harmonic presentation.
A harmonic presentation. So that one is interesting because, there you're looking at, you could be talking about social harmony, you could be talking about musical harmony, like harmony. Do you know the etymology of harmony offhand?
I don't.
I'm curious about that.
I will look it up while we're talking away here.
Yeah, because harmony is a word that's another word that we use in a lot of different ways to mean a lot of different things.
Here we go. All right, so it's Greek. Harmos means joint. Latin harmonia means joining and concord. So
a joint whole.
A joint
whole. So separate pieces that are brought together to be one thing.
And concord suggests balance.
It
suggests amity, friendship, or non-violence.
Yeah. So that makes sense, and it's funny that this is already connecting to the conversation I had less than 18 hours ago with Dr. Fujian Zhang talking about dualities, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of almost like yin and yang, right? You have these things that sometimes they're opposites, sometimes they're not opposites, but they're just separated. But it's our brain's way of characterizing these things as being separate or being opposites that sort of affects our reality. And of course, you and I have talked about Heraclitus not stepping in the same river, or the ship of Theseus, this continuity versus discontinuity sort of concept.
Yes.
And trying to determine if these categories that we talk about actually exist in reality. So that's what we were talking about yesterday in this idea of dualities. Symmetry, we're thinking about, in some ways, the same thing. Maybe not so much in biological symmetry. In that case, it's obvious that the joint whole is one thing. Mm-hmm. But in some of the other things that we'll talk about as the show goes on in physics or in some of these other things, when you think about the joint whole, you go, well, is that categorization of what we're examining true, or is that just a conceptual tool that we use to help our human brains understand what's going on?
That's a metaphor.
So yeah, exactly. So has symmetry been talked about philosophically, or are we sort of off on our own here?
Been talked about philosophically, actually investigating it. It's interesting. It's been talked about philosophically, but again, primarily from the aesthetic route back in the old times. And it never went away from that. But once science kicks in, once physics really kicks in, but any kind of technological, part of mechanistic theory, part of machine building has symmetry built in. It's we were just talking about carpentry. Why do we want joints that are of equal sides? Well, there are specific utilitarian or points of utility for that, as well as that it looks better than, let's see, you have one piece and then 1 inch below it the next piece, but then 2 inches below that the next prong or finger or whatever the term would be. It's a lattice and a lattice is symmetrical, right? And so when science kicks in and you start to work out this, we're working in physics and then metaphysics but you can use microscopes and start to go down to the crystalline nature of things. And we look at crystals. We look at snowflakes. Before you could look at a snowflake really closely, you didn't know that every snowflake was unique and every snowflake is symmetrical.
Yeah.
But once you find that out and you realize, okay, so science profoundly foundationalizes the evidence of symmetry, then it becomes much not the sole purview of science, but then I think science and the arts are in a push me pull you kind of relationship.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into this in more detail as we go on. But I've experienced this recently at work. In engineering, right? Design philosophy, right? We make a product for a much larger company. So we make it and they make it. We're a contract manufacturer for them. So they wanted to create new molds for this part, right? And our engineer and their engineers going back and forth about what the design of the mold should be, right? And their engineer wanted a 3-cavity mold, and our engineer was pushing for a 2-cavity. And the big sticking point was their engineer wanted 3-cavity because it would increase productivity. And in the same, in just a slightly expanded amount of time, you could make an extra part, right? So it's more cost effective. Our engineer wanted 2 because he's been doing this for 43 years. And he said that he's never seen a mold with an odd number of cavitation work properly. The way that the material flows, the way that things work. He said, the less space that you have to get symmetrical from the injection point, the smaller the surface area, the more likely you are to succeed. So, even though a 3-cavity, it's an odd number, but it is symmetrical because that third part will be in the center.
Yeah.
The surface area of that part being in the center where the material flows in, the likelihood of getting all of that surface area perfectly symmetrical so that the rubber will flow to both of the other cavities evenly is very difficult. Whereas if you just have the inject point come down and then 2 tubes go to either side, it's much easier to measure that and make sure that the diameters of those holes are even in order to fill out the parts properly.
So so in the discussion mixed in is experiential learning, history of proven success, a viewpoint of a veteran engineer coming up against a viewpoint of probably younger engineers with different ideas. And so what a fascinating conversation.
And of course, under the overarching umbrella of capitalism and productivity. And long story short, we ended up going with the 2-cavity mold. Our engineer ended up reviewing some of the plans and discovering many other things that had been overlooked and that need to be done. Well, if we get a 3-cavity mold, suddenly it becomes too heavy for the shuttle system to move the plate out. Suddenly it becomes too heavy for the forklifts to pick up. Suddenly, so there was other things that led to the ultimate conclusion. But it's just interesting. It was interesting to see those discussions start at the very beginning level before any steel had been purchased or before any tool had touched a die, to see this sort of debate over which direction should we go and why.
What's also interesting to me is that a large company defaulted to the argument based on logic, rationality, and experience of the smaller company.
Yeah, and that's sort of been the story of our relationship with them, is they have been very quick to acquiesce to some of our suggestions, which is very rare because we work with a lot of big companies, and that's not the norm. So what kinds of symmetries are there? What are some different types of symmetries?
All right. Well, let's start with what we've already said and move out. So there's aesthetic symmetry, which can be subcategorized. Let's be Western. Musical theory, symmetry, visual arts symmetry, and then further broken down to the visual arts would be including representations of the human face, let's say, or the human body. Okay. Then we have anatomical symmetry, which is science, and all the subcategories that would involve with the human body. Just broad strokes here. And then we have physics symmetry, and there were four kinds, one of which I admittedly can't even begin to say that I understand, and I would be a fraud if I did, and I don't want to be a fraud. That would never be fun for me. But there's reflectional symmetry. There's well, I lost the term, but side-to-side symmetry. So reflection would be if you looked at it in the mirror and the parts go together. So that'd be side-to-side. There's a kind of a holistic symmetry where if you take a part from one half of something, put in the other half, transfer parts, it's still going to look exactly alike. That's a start.
Yeah. Yeah, and if the listeners are having a hard time conceptualizing that second one, just picture if you drew a line down the middle of your body, if you took your left nostril and put it on the right side of your face, without flipping it, you'd look pretty strange, right? But that would still be a type of symmetry, technically.
It would, and then the natural symmetry of a kind that's in geology, referencing the geode earlier, or butterflies.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of different types of symmetry in nature. With mammals, you mostly see that mirror symmetry. If you drew a line down the middle, our left half is a mirror image of the right half. But if you move down the evolutionary chain a little bit, you get to animals or to plants or simple animals. You see a lot of rotational symmetry, which is where if you kind of drew a dot in the middle and then you cut pie slices off of it, each slice is sort of the same. You could spin it around and access it.
So that's and then there's the mathematical with proportionate, a symmetry of proportion, so that something on either side of a formula has to work.
Yeah, and there's visual representations of that, which are fractals. And if you ever want to see a cool video, if you look up fractals online, you'll see it. Where so proportionally, if you look at this image, they'll zoom in, and then as you zoom in, all of a sudden you see that image pop up as a piece of the larger image, and you can continue to zoom in ad infinitum, and you'll continue to see that same image pop up.
Yeah.
So which is really neat. So there's all of these different types of symmetries, and again, we'll try to talk about some of the scientific ones, but it's admittedly beyond our level of expertise with some of them. Does symmetry exist?
Well, do we perceive it? Do we seek it? Two separate questions. If we perceive it, it's there phenomenologically. If we seek it, we want to see it. And I think both of those things go on.
Yeah.
If you look at a still shot of a butterfly, especially if the old 19th century science pinning butterfly, but even if you don't, you're more gentle, you can see this, then there is a mirror relation between the two parts. If you draw an imaginary line down through the human form, a standard human form seems to have a symmetry. But it's called, of course, illusional, because even though, there's a thing called the golden mean, or the golden radius, and recently, all of the James Bond actors' images, dead and living, were uploaded into this algorithm that was looking for the face that was the most precisely symmetrical and therefore the most handsome. Turns out it was Pierce Brosnan. Then, interestingly, Daniel Craig, and then it goes on down the list. But the people who presented this rather humorous, funny study underlying it is the depth of the question you just asked. Because, of course, if you look closely at anyone's face, the eye is not exactly the same size, and there's a little bit of offness in the eyebrow, and as you say, nostrils and everything. The more wrinkles may be on one side of the face than the other as we age. So it's not a perfect symmetry.
Yeah. I've seen a couple of videos of this online, where they take actors' faces and then they'll Photoshop them to fit the golden ratio, essentially. And it is interesting to see it happen.
And it puts you back in the uncanny valley just a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we know there isn't perfection.
Right. And some of these people, you have to distort their faces so much that you would think, well, if this is the idea of a perfect face, then this person must be ugly based upon how much editing you had to do. But they're not. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more that goes into, I think, aesthetic beauty than symmetry. I think the funniest example of this is Harrison Ford. I think there's a meme that goes around that says Harrison Ford is the only person on earth who can smile at you with one side of his face and frown at you with the other side. And you know, just the way his eyes are and his mouth are, it's very asymmetrical, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so this idea, right, and this is sort of the root at what we always get down to. If we ask, right, does symmetry exist? It's sort of a multi-level question. If we think about it just aesthetically, I think that's our best chance of saying, yes, it does exist, right? Because all those examples that you mentioned are perfectly relevant and accurate examples of phenomenologically establishing symmetry. Now, you can pick those apart, right? Like you said, where do we draw the line on what is symmetrical? Because at the barest level, we could say, well, I have an eye on each side of my face. That's so I'm symmetrical, right?
Rough symmetry.
Yeah. But then, as you get closer, you go, well, no, your eyes should be the same size, the same shape, the same distance from the sagittal plane, the same color, the same, So, how close can you get? And you can see that if you continue down a sort of reductionist route, you could say, well, you get to a point where, no, there really isn't any symmetry, right? Because, you could get down to there's technically more rod cells or more cone cells in one eye than the other, so they're not symmetrical, right?
Right, on that level.
So I think that would be the easiest level at which to establish that symmetry exists, would be the aesthetic
and the quantum level. And this isn't a plug for an upcoming movie, but but at the quantum level, it's where it all falls apart. It's why this disjointedness in this ongoing quest to find a theory of everything doesn't work, because on a grand scale, there seems to be all kinds of perceptual symmetry. But when you work down to the quantum, it's chaos.
Yeah. This is where the conversation gets really interesting, right? Because it's this idea of supersymmetry in physics, right? And this idea basically says, okay, well, what we know about the universe, we've categorized, right? And we've reduced to the periodic table. We can look at the periodic table and say, okay, we can't explain dark energy or dark matter, but you know what? We know about 5% of everything in the universe. This is what it boils down to, this periodic table. Mm. Well, that bugs scientists, right? They don't like not knowing stuff. So you go, okay, well, we got to figure out what that other 95% of stuff is. Well, and like you said, we look around the universe and we see symmetry. So they say, well, maybe dark matter is it's just a mirror version of the periodic table. There's heavier elements that directly correlate with the elements that we currently know on the periodic table. They call that supersymmetry. And so they have, they developed CERN particle collider in part to explore this theory. They said, okay, well, if we can get high enough energy densities and we can smash particles together at great enough velocities, maybe we can see some of these super heavy, super symmetrical particles emerge. But when they started smashing them together, what they found is that the heavier particles they were finding did not correlate to the periodic table. Mm-hmm. So as it stands, there really isn't any evidence to support supersymmetry. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of evidence that sort of points to the fact that that's not how the universe works.
The universe likes to poke at such theories, and it's important to have the theories. But if you go back to Plato, in the Timaeus, one of the dialogues, I mean, I remember talking about this with a philosophy professor way back, decades ago, because the idea was that all natural elements fall within 5 polyhedral shapes. Well, that's great. So you call fire a regular tetrahedron. Earth is the form of the cube, square. Okay, but that's not quite. The air is the form of the regular octahedron, and so on and so on. And you get to the place where Kepler is saying that all in the strong astronomical terms, the whole visible universe at that point, which was much less visible than now, is grounded in these 5 solids. And then the reason I bring that up is because what you were just talking about before, when it all breaks down, well, symmetry can be perceived, it can be sought. When you seek it by trying to force it into a model, then you almost can be certain that model is going to break apart.
Yeah, and that's where there's this sort of crisis in physics, right? And you and I, we just finished reading a book, Existential Physics, by Sabine Hausenfelder. Great book, and I really like what she did with it, which was saying, the book goes through and it essentially, it's sort of a book of dispelling misbeliefs.
Yeah.
Both on the side of the layperson who maybe has read a lot of popular science articles, as well as on the part of physicists who she sees as kind of overstepping in their conclusions about what they actually know. And, it's a fascinating book to read. But even within that, taking what she was saying, which was presenting what is known about physics, there's something in the back of my head, right, that's going, yeah, but even the stuff that we say we know doesn't add up. And she mentions that at a couple points. She says there's going to be a point at some point in the future where we're going to have to come up with a theory different from the standard model of physics. So, but why is that so hard? The reason that's so hard is that the scientific theories we currently have, quantum mechanics, relativity, Newtonian physics, these things explain everything so well, So if you go, well, if these theories are explaining 99.99999% of what we can observe, then they've got to be close to being right? We don't have to tear down the whole thing and rebuild it, do we? But, as she's going through and talking about stuff, it's sort of, becoming evident that might need to happen at some point.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for that is this lack of symmetry, right? If you think about, we go back to the etymology of the word, a harmonious whole. They can't find the harmony between quantum mechanics and relativity. They can't find how these things relate to explain what we see. And
we want to believe. Scientists the world over would be laughing at me for my naivete in saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think we want to believe that there has to be an all-encompassing unity. Because we can't accept that this can work on this level, but this works on this level, but the two wouldn't work together. But I think of the gears or sprockets toy that a little one has, and you put the different colored sprockets in order, you turn a handle and they all start turning each other. And that's a great way for little ones to get used to the idea of mechanics, right? But how can we have this piece and it has no way of attaching to this other piece?
Yeah.
We want a symmetrical whole, but our theories, well grounded in evidence at the moment, don't allow for that. So we can't have this beautiful machine that we want to see.
Yeah, so it's very paradoxical what's going on, right? Because there's a lot of assumptions that undergird physics, such as regarding symmetry, right? As like the universe, which is to say, okay, if you look in any direction, it's going to be the same.
Yep.
And so scientists have built lots of theories and lots of mathematics on top of this principle that have done an excellent job explaining what we see. But then evidence starts emerging that it is not the same if you look in every direction. Looking at the cosmic microwave background or the structures of voids or galaxy clusters, they go, well, actually, this stuff is not evenly distributed. But what happens to all of those theories and all of that science that was built on that assumption that does explain things so well?
Yeah, I should admit. And this takes us into another thing, the branch which we haven't talked about yet in philosophy, which is philosophical symmetry. One level of it is the belief, is the observation, or the assertion that true and false beliefs come from the same causes. So there's a symmetry of true and false belief because of that same cause. And we've talked about things like this earlier, much earlier. But that's sort of another mirror symmetry, but it's not the same thing as a mirror. And it's the kind of thing we're talking about now where scientific research leads to theory and it leads to claims, but those claims aren't necessarily knowledge or complete knowledge.
Yeah, it's as if all of our knowledge, all of humanity's knowledge is verisimilitudinous, right? It's not true, but it has elements of truth in it that explain what we see very well, right? And so that's what makes it so difficult to say, well, let's tear the whole thing apart and rebuild it again. Well, but it just does such a good job. I'm currently learning about this in my developmental psychology class as they're covering different types of theories, right? And the first one is mechanistic theory, which is behavioral theories, like Skinner and some of these Watson, talking about how essentially we live in a deterministic universe, and it boils down to initial states, which is what physics today still believes, right? You take the initial conditions, you expand it out, and everything continues on the way it is. So human beings are passive, and basically it's either genetics if it's nature, or it's stimulus response if it's nurture, that ends up kind of guiding us through life. But what psychologists found is like, okay, well, no, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense, right? And so off of that, they developed organismic models, which is some of the life stage models, like Piaget and Erickson and some of these other guys that say, a mechanistic model is it's based on quantity, right? If you have so much of something, if you add more, you get to the next level. Whereas an organismic model says, no, there's emergent properties when you get to new levels. So if you add up enough of these things, you don't just end up with more of those things. You actually end up with new properties emerging. And I think that, and then even that is an outdated model. Now they're looking at relational developmental systems, which integrates aspects of your context and your time frame point and your interactions with other things and whatnot. But so within psychology, this idea of a mechanistic universe has been left in the dust for decades, right? But that's still the model that physics operates under, right? So because physics, it needs to, right? This idea of emergent properties of things, novel, unique things emerging from something lower doesn't work. You have to have this particle element that makes it work, and that's where the symmetry comes in, right?
Well, that's partly, I think, again, at a layperson level, what entanglement is about.
Yeah.
So particles, twin particles, parallel particles, no matter what part of the universe they're in, behave the same way at the same moment.
Mm. Yeah, and that is not just some wacky scientific theory. They've experimentally proven this.
Yeah.
There's a couple ways you can see it. One way is in Hawking radiation, where black holes evaporate. You can create black holes on Earth, and they don't suck the whole Earth in. They just disappear because as the particles pop in and out of existence, one particle will pop into existence inside the black hole, one will pop into existence outside the black hole. And so the fact that you never have mass added to it, you only have particles sort of losing it, the black hole will eventually lose mass. Quantum computing, which is still in its infancy, is based on this principle of entanglement, that you can get things to operate in that sort of way. So this is scientifically observable, measurable, predictable. So it's real, right? Mm-hmm. But again, it's a paradox, right? You hold your finger out in front of you and you see two fingers because you're looking at it through two different eyes. That's basically what we're dealing with the physics portion of it, and then with the social sciences, or it's kind of the philosophical or humanities portion of it. Is you look at these things and you go, okay, they're not one harmonious whole. So there's not symmetry in how we understand reality, which is what keeps scientists up at night, right? What keeps philosophers up at night.
If you even go back to the aesthetic, ancient philosopher named Plotinus, who said that essentially that symmetry itself is not beauty. Beauty is the light that passes over the symmetrical object. Well, okay, and you're making me think about this, of all kinds of things, which we know from an illusionary viewpoint that physics can explain. Putting a pencil in water, and the pencil looks like it is bent.
Yeah,
and that's because of properties of light and gravitation and such. But there's still a kind of symmetry, half the pencil this way, half the pencil that way, if you will. But it's not that the symmetry is the beautiful part, or what one is trying to achieve. It's how you see it. That's an ancient observation that still holds.
Yeah, and that's the interest. That's an interesting part. Going back to aesthetics a little bit about it is, we talk about how symmetry is beauty, right? Like that's what people say. That's what the golden ratio is about. All these things, but kind of the number one rule of aesthetic art is to not create a symmetrical thing. They always tell you, okay, you want to put a subject off in the corner.
The rule of threes.
Yeah. You want to split your canvas into thirds, and you want to make sure things that, or you look at some of the sculptures, David or, a discus thrower, these sorts of things. They're not posed in such a way that their arms are mirroring each other or their legs are mirroring each other. They're always in something that flows a certain way. So this idea of aesthetic symmetry as being beautiful, it almost makes you wonder if they're, and like we talked about with the actors, that you sort of force into this perfectly symmetrical box and it creates this uncanny kind of image. You go, well, no, beauty is not symmetry. There is something more to it.
Yeah.
And that is sort of a metaphorical or an analogy for some of the bigger symmetries that we've talked about, right? Is this, we want to think of the universe as being symmetrical.
And then we get surprised when the James Webb Telescope shows us these incredible images and fills us with more perplexion. Because now we're seeing galaxies that aren't looking the way that they're supposed to look back toward the beginning of universal time.
Yeah.
They're not the right shape, blasted. And there are too many of them. And so our expectations are blown up. But of course, that just sets ethical and marvelous scientists off at, okay, now we got to think about this some more. We got to try to, how does this cohere with what else we've known? I think it's in I think it's what you were getting at before. I think this holds true for us, whether science on that level, which is impossible for a layperson or unlikely, down to ordinary things. We don't. If we try to make all of what we encounter fit what we thought we knew, and that's the primary purpose, then we're missing the encounter. And the encounter has to be the instructive part that says, well, maybe you need to throw a lot of this away. Maybe not all of it, but maybe a lot of it. My daughter-in-law is this marvelous artist, and she works with ceramics, clay, and she has shown me that often when you're shaping something, you're going to peel a lot of the clay off. And in fact, sometimes it all just goes onto a lump and you start all over again. That's where art, I think, informs, as a metaphor, informs good science. Sometimes you can rescue. I know this in doing my own work. Sometimes, well, rescue is not the right word. Sometimes you have happy accidents that lead you to what you thought you were envisioning more than the chapter and verse of what you thought your fingers were doing.
Yeah. And, the reason we ended up in the spot that we are in physics is due to symmetry, right? At one point, they were looking at galaxies and the way that they spin, and they said, well, wait a minute, these things are not spinning the way that they should be. If you have the gravitational center, at the center, then the outside should necessarily spin slower than the middle. Mm-hmm. But they're finding just the opposite. The outside is spinning faster, right? And that's really what sort of shook up the whole standard model of physics, is they said, oh, that's when they had to bring dark matter in. They saw galaxies sort of speeding away from us, and they had to bring dark energy in, right? And you go, I think it was P.W. Anderson had the quote, science is the study of symmetry, right? And I think that's applicable, right? Because if you think about our scientific developments, they revolve around these problems of symmetry, these things where you go, just when you think you have it all figured out, okay, yeah, we got a good working model of how the universe works. All of a sudden you stumble upon something and you go, oh, wait, this is no longer a harmonious whole. Yeah. Now we have to, and the question is, do we keep putting patches on it? Do we keep putting on a patch so that it remains?
Do we cling?
Yeah.
Do we cling, or do we not? Edith Wharton, who's a marvelous writer, pointed towards something like this. She said, the desire for symmetry, for balance, for rhythm in form as well as in sound, is one of the most inveterate of human instincts. It's embedded in us. why it's embedded in us, for me, is really the question. And a composer such as John Cage will do outrageously marvelous and disturbing musical creations. We listen or experience part of those perhaps, and somehow we just push away from it because that's not a symphony in the way we think a symphony would be. And yet there's something vitally creative going on in these things, but we snap back to rhythm and symmetry, and we look for those things when we listen to poetry, or whether we realize we're looking for them or not, or a good song, as you've said from time to time, or it's everywhere, but it's in us. Why is it in us? And I think maybe that's partly what your class is investigating.
Do you think symmetry is a necessary emergent property of the universe?
That's a fascinating question. If it is, as Wharton says, an inveterate is a human instinct, and I know people debate the idea of instinct all the time, but we'll just go with it also as a metaphor. It's just what if it is. Does that mean it has a use? Well, parts of us no longer have a use. Does that mean that is the fundamental principle to which we must always adhere? I don't necessarily think so, but I don't necessarily think we ought to throw it away either just for the sake of throwing it away. I think we have to think about it. Why do we want this? And is that the emergent universe? What are you asking then? Does the universe tell us that we ought to be adhering to symmetry, or is the universe kicking us and saying, stop it?
I think that this is the interesting part, right? Is that scientists, physicists in particular, want this supersymmetry. They want to have this theory of everything. They want to have everything be symmetrical, right? But if you look back, we have the evidence, we have the observations to look at the initial states of the universe, and the conclusion that they come to is that if the universe had been symmetrical, nothing would exist. If there had been a perfectly symmetrical distribution of matter and antimatter, or if there had been, a completely symmetrical explosion of the Big Bang in the form of the cosmic microwave background, there would be nothing. There'd be nothing, right? Yes. These very, if you look at it, right, matter and antimatter were almost symmetrical, but there was just a little bit more matter, and that's why we're here. Yeah. The cosmic microwave background was almost a symmetrical explosion, but not quite. There was these tiny, almost imperceptible cold spots that led to clumping, and that clumping factor allowed galaxies and stars and planets to exist.
So this is the anthropic principle that you're headed toward, right?
Yeah. So you keep boiling that back, right? You start at the Big Bang, and then you go to galaxies and to stars and to planets and to snowflakes and to people, and you go, it's back like what I was saying with aesthetic symmetry, right? If we are to say, well, I have 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes, I'm symmetrical, then you're not necessarily wrong. But the closer you start to look, the less symmetrical things are. That's sort of reflected in the universe, right? You look and you see symmetry everywhere, but if you look into that symmetry closer, you find things that are not symmetrical.
And I think that is so important to social, humanistic, emotional, psychological, the whole zeitgeist. Because the way people respond to someone without a limb, or without many limbs, or one eye, or a patch on there, whatever, and it's a struggle for some people, and often the first thought is, that poor person, they just can't quite be as human as the rest of us. It's an awful, awful thought. And I think we're making progress with that. But that's the negative for me side of this worship of symmetry. So if someone has a limp, or you can extend that into almost anything. If someone is so introverted that they decide not to speak at all, that's not right, because that therefore betrays a bias of what is right, which is normal, and what normal has been dictated by not common sense, but it's been presented as that, but dictated by what people want to be normal. So that takes us back to the question you asked before, which is symmetry, how did you put it? Is symmetry real, or is it something we perceive? Yes.
Yeah. This again, my developmental psychology course is touching on this, where they're talking about the new theories are doing what physics can't do, right? They're tearing the whole thing down and building it up again, because what they're finding is that, the statistics, right? The statistic, when you get down to the mathematics of how our conception of human development and human normality works, these ANOVAs and regressions and things, you are starting from the philosophical assumption that a normal human exists. And that if you just look at a large enough sample of people, that there will be normalcy that will emerge from that. And the new theories are saying, that's ridiculous. Normality does not exist. Human development necessarily has to be an ideographic endeavor. You have to look at the individual characteristics of the person in their context, in their period of history, in their relationships, in their physiological development. Every single one of these factors contributes to their behavior and their thought patterns and how they work. Now that creates a crisis, right? Because it necessarily limits the scope of developmental science. You all of a sudden you have to rethink how you do the mathematics. You have to rethink how you're doing your studies.
And it makes ideology a whole lot harder. If you start defining normal, those that have power are the ones that define what normal is in any particular culture, then you can hammer away at people and get them to espouse all kinds of things about freedom that they really don't mean. Well, it can be used just in vile, awful way, and is, because ideology is emergent from the ideology requires a consistency of vision that is narrow. And we are now progressing past that in psychological science, in physics, but not necessarily in political culture.
Yeah. All right. I think this is one of our best conversations ever. So stay tuned for physics part, or symmetry part 2, 3, 4, or maybe aesthetic symmetry and mathematical symmetry. I just see this spilling over into so many different things that I'm sure we're going to revisit it. But until next time.